Picking up from our previous session, creating a cup, let's go in and take a look at making something a bit more interesting. For this demonstration, I want to take a look at creating this blue flower shape. To create this type of design, we can do this by using our Radial Symmetry and experiment with using the default move and standard brushes, and then we'll introduce a few other brush techniques that we can do to create some final effects here. So to start off, I'm going into Lightbox, opening up the Project tab and double-clicking to load our Dynamesh 128 resolution sphere, which I have currently set in the canvas. Now the next step, I want to go in and enable my Radial Symmetry. So let's put our transform palette in the tray, disable our X, turn on our Y, and let's enable that radial counter. To begin creating this shape, first we want to go through and create the extrusion or the sculpted brush effect on the surface, which we can then go in and apply twisting effects later, maybe experimenting with using the move brush to create the final shape as well as this twisting. So zooming up on the mesh here. First, I want to find the correct Z intensity to actually find the right bump in the surface for this brush effect. So increasing my Z intensity, finding the right extrusion distance, as well as finding the correct radial count to create the exact space we want to have between these brush strokes. So increasing or decreasing the draw size will play a part into the spacing between the brush strokes themselves. So a higher brush stroke is going to put these much closer together. Smaller brush stroke is going to create a little bit more space between it. And then compounding this with the radial count as well. So finding that right draw size, I want these to be about this thick. And also we want to take note of the mesh surface itself. So you can see the resolution on the mesh doesn't quite have enough to create a nice clean stroke here. So let's go into our geometry Dynamesh tab, and I'll set this resolution to around 500, and let's control drag to give ourselves some more points to work with. So now testing this is giving me a much cleaner brush stroke on the surface. However, in this case, I want to create a nice clean straight line across that surface, and using the default standard brush may be difficult to create a perfectly straight line going down this mesh. So let's take a look at some of the brush settings inside of our stroke palette and make this a bit easier. So I'll undo this stroke, and let's go in and click on the stroke palette and click and drag this over into our tray. Within the stroke palette, we have the option to take a look at the lazy mouse settings. With the standard brush, you'll see the default lazy mouse option. We have this enabled. And just below this, we have a lazy step slider as well as a lazy radius. The lazy radius slider is going to give us the ability to create a smoother, cleaner line by increasing this slider. So this can go to a maximum of 200. So let's set this to 100. And take note, as I draw on the surface, the red lazy mouse line gives me a control to create a smoother, cleaner, and straighter effect. So doing things like zigzags and controlling your brush strokes a bit more, the higher we set this, the longer that lazy radius controller is going to be to give me a cleaner, smoother effect when I go through to do these brush applications. So let's set our lazy radius to 100. And in this case, I want to draw a perfectly straight line down this mesh. Now, as we begin to draw down the surface, once the lazy mouse line, the red line here, is activated, we can press the shift key, which will lock this to 90 degrees. And now as I continue to drag while holding shift, this will complete the stroke or allow me to continue to pull this stroke down. And when I want to apply this to the surface, keeping my cursor down on the canvas and letting go of shift, and you'll see that this is continuing to apply that stroke, and I can continue to drag this down that mesh. Now, taking a look at the brush stroke itself, you can see there's a little bit of rivets happening with this stroke. And this effect comes from the lazy stepping. So the default lazy step is 0.25. So that's leaving just a tiny bit of lazy stepping on the stroke itself. So we can reduce this down to, say, 0.1 to create a even smoother, cleaner line with this brush stroke. So now we've got a nice clean brush application. And let's find that correct draw size here. So I'm just going to test this to find the spacing between these. That looks good. So I'm going to undo this and now click, begin to pull this out and hold the shift key now. Let's drag this down and let go of shift to continue that line. So now we have a nice clean application on this surface. And before we go in and apply any twisting effect to start to get this sort of spiraling look here, let's take a look at what's happening here at the top. So you can see at the top we have these nice clean flower-like shapes, which we could apply by experimenting with the Damien standard brush. So I'm going to select this brush, and let's go take a look at our radial settings. We'll reduce these down to around 30. So by default, this brush carving into the surface, we can kind of go in here and create a sort of spiral-like effect to get a nice clean detailed shape or interesting looking shape here. Now with this brush, we can also go in and take a look at our stroke palette. And you can see that the Damien standard brush has different lazy mouse settings. So the lazy mouse settings, if I go back to standard, exist per brush. So by going in and adjusting the standard brush, if I want to make any lazy adjustments to the Damien standard, I can select this brush and let's go in and increase that lazy mouse radius. And now you'll see here, when applying this on the surface, I get a nice clean brush effect to give me a bit more control with my sculpture details. So we can experiment with different ways of spiraling this stuff together to create this interesting flower-like effect. And we can continue to use this to polish up any additional lines or continue to do any sculpture details on the remaining portions of the mesh. Now I want to go in here and apply the spiraling effect here. So getting these rivets to sort of shoot around the mesh and maybe reshaping this to finish this up. So let's rotate to the front view of this and enabling the move brush. We can actually make use of the move brush in different ways. Looking at this from the top orthographic view, so rotating and holding shift, if I do a larger move brush size here, I can actually go in and start to spiral this mesh and play around with the overall details of this. So just pushing this and pulling this around. And then once we have a nice effect happening here, we can then go in and take a look from the front orthographic. So maybe reducing that move size down to something smaller. And now increasing or decreasing. So if I want to hit a smaller area here, just to shrink this in, decreasing that move brush and starting to pull these shapes out. Grabbing the move brush, we can even go in here with a radial count and begin to sort of pull out additional shapes. So making a slight design change from the original piece. And as we continue to pull out parts of this mesh, if we need to increase that resolution or add better resolution in the mesh, let's go ahead and hold Control and drag on the surface, which is going to re-dynamesh that. Now I can start to continue to sculpt and experiment with this. So here in this example, I've gone through and I've just applied this technique by only dealing with sculpting on the surface itself. So we haven't gone in and introduced any color. So if you take a look at the original render here, we've got a color value of blue, and then we've also got some green paint in the surface as well. Now let's go through and let's repeat this process, but let's apply this with paint so we can see the overall effect with color and sculpture detail at the same time.